The story of the American Revolution does not begin with cannon fire or the waving of flags. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, in the daily frustrations of ordinary people. Farmers, merchants, and craftsmen across the 13 colonies lived their lives under the rule of a distant king, across an ocean they would never see. For a long time, they accepted it. Britain was their protector, their trade partner, their link to the wider world. But slowly, seeds of rebellion began to take root. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain found itself drowning in debt. To recover, Parliament turned toward its colonies. They saw America as a place to draw revenue, not as an equal partner. And so, laws and taxes began to appear. The Sugar Act of 1764. The Stamp Act of 1765. Each one pressed heavier on the colonists' daily lives. Suddenly, paper for legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards required an official stamp, purchased with money that flowed back to Britain. At first, many colonists felt confusion rather than anger. They had always paid local taxes to their assemblies, but now they were told to send money across the ocean to a government where they had no voice. The phrase was whispered in taverns and meeting halls: no taxation without representation. It was not just about money, it was about dignity, about the right to decide one's own fate. Resistance grew quietly at first. Pamphlets spread ideas faster than muskets. Writers like James Otis and Samuel Adams sharpened their words into weapons. In Boston, crowds gathered, protesting outside the homes of tax collectors. Some demonstrations turned violent. Effigies of British officials were burned. Offices were ransacked. What Britain had imagined as simple administration was beginning to unravel into open defiance. The tension exploded in 1765 when the Stamp Act Congress met in New York. Representatives from 9 colonies gathered to declare that Parliament had no right to tax them. It was not yet independence, they sought only respect, only recognition of their rights as Englishmen. But Britain did not see it that way. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act after a storm of protest, but the relief was short-lived. In its place came the Townshend Acts of 1767, taxing glass, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, the colonies erupted in anger. Merchants boycotted British goods. Homespun clothing became a badge of honor, a silent rebellion worn on the streets. The more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped away. Boston became the beating heart of unrest. There, red-coated British soldiers marched in the streets, reminding every man, woman, and child of the empire's power. Yet the presence of soldiers did not silence the people, it enraged them. On the night of March 5, 1770, a crowd gathered around a group of British soldiers outside the customs house. Snowballs were thrown. Then rocks, insults filled the air, sharp and bitter. The soldiers, tense and surrounded, raised their muskets. A shot rang out, then another. By the end, 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. The event would be remembered as the Boston Massacre. To the Crown, it was an unfortunate riot. To the colonists, it was proof that Britain saw them not as subjects, but as enemies. Engravings of the event spread across the colonies, showing soldiers firing into an innocent crowd. The image was powerful, and its effect was lasting. In the years that followed, the anger simmered. Britain continued its policies, and the colonies responded with resistance. But nothing symbolized their defiance more than tea. In 1773, Parliament granted the struggling East India Company the right to sell its tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. To the British, it was a practical solution. To the colonists, it was a trap, forcing them to accept Parliament's right to tax them. And so, on a cold December night in Boston Harbor, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships. With calm determination, they cracked open chests of tea and spilled their contents into the dark water below. The sea turned black with the leaves of over 90,000 pounds of tea. The world would remember this night as the Boston Tea Party. Britain's patience snapped. They called these acts intolerable, and their response would push the colonies further than they had ever gone before toward open rebellion. By the early 1770s, the bond between Britain and its colonies had stretched to the breaking point. The Boston Tea Party had not simply been an act of defiance, it was a declaration of spirit. The message was clear. The colonies would no longer be silent. Britain, in turn, responded with fury. They passed the coercive acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, shutting down Boston Harbor, stripping Massachusetts of self-government and placing the colony under direct military control. To many in America, it felt as if their liberties were being strangled. What had begun as protest over taxes was now something greater. It was about power. It was about the future. And, slowly, men and women across the colonies began to ask themselves a dangerous question: were they still subjects? Or were they something new? In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Never before had the colonies united in this way. The men who walked into that hall, George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, were still British subjects in name, but their hearts burned with a different fire. They issued petitions to the king, pleading for their rights. They organized boycotts of British goods. They spoke carefully, but beneath their words lay the spark of independence. Britain dismissed their pleas. To the crown, the colonies were not partners, but possessions. And if possessions resisted, they would be subdued. The night of April 18, 1775 was quiet in the town of Lexington, Massachusetts. Lanterns flickered in windows, families slept. But on the roads outside Boston, hundreds of British soldiers marched silently, their orders clear: seize colonial weapons stored in the town of Concord, and arrest leaders of the rebellion. They moved quickly, hoping to strike before the colonists could react, but the countryside was awake. Riders spread the alarm. The most famous among them, Paul Revere, galloped through the dark, shouting his warning: "The British are coming!" Doors opened, candles lit, muskets pulled from above fireplaces. Farmers and blacksmiths left their beds and gathered in the cold night air. They were not professional soldiers. They were neighbors, friends, fathers. They called themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. At dawn on April 19th, on the green at Lexington, about 70 Minutemen stood in a nervous line. Across from them, a much larger force of British regulars approached, their redcoats bright against the morning mist. For a long moment, the two sides stared at one another. The air was thick with silence. Then, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but the echo of that musket shot carried across the world. It was the shot heard round the world. The British soldiers fired a volley, and the Minutemen scattered. 8 colonists lay dead. The soldiers marched on toward Concord, but the countryside was alive now, and every step they took was shadowed by anger. At Concord's North Bridge, another group of Minutemen waited. This time, they did not break. They returned fire. The British, stunned, began a long retreat back to Boston. From behind stone walls and trees, militia fired upon them all the way home. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The war had begun. In the weeks that followed, militia from across New England gathered outside Boston. They laid siege to the city, trapping the British inside. The once loyal colonies had taken up arms against their own empire. There was no turning back. Still, many hoped for reconciliation. When the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in May 1775, some delegates spoke of loyalty to the king. Others, like John Adams, argued that war was now inevitable. In the middle of debate, the Congress made a decision that would change history. They appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was tall, dignified, and carried himself with calm authority. He was not yet a legend, but he soon would be. Only a month later, the colonists faced their greatest test yet. On June 17, 1775, British forces launched an assault on colonial positions on Breed's Hill, near Boston. The colonists dug into earthen fortifications, waited as wave after wave of red-coated soldiers advanced. Twice, the British were driven back. Ammunition was running low, and commanders whispered the famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." On the third assault, the colonists could no longer hold. They retreated, but not before inflicting heavy casualties. Over 1,000 British killed or wounded. The battle would be remembered as the Battle of Bunker Hill, though technically a British victory. It proved something extraordinary. The colonists could stand against the greatest army in the world. Meanwhile, voices of defiance grew louder. Pamphlets spread like wildfire, none more famous than Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Written in simple, powerful language, it declared that monarchy itself was a system of tyranny, and that America's destiny was independence. For many who still wavered, Paine's words were a revelation. As 1775 turned into 1776, the colonies were no longer asking for respect. They were demanding freedom. The spark had become a flame, and soon, that flame would light the document that changed the world. By the summer of 1776, the colonies stood at a crossroads. The battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had already stained the earth with blood. A continental army, under George Washington, now marched beneath a new banner, but still, the colonies hesitated. Were they truly ready to cut ties with the most powerful empire on earth? The question was not just political, it was deeply personal. Many colonists still called themselves loyal to Britain, bound by heritage and tradition. Families were divided, friends argued across tavern tables. To seek independence was to risk everything: their homes, their trade, their lives. If they failed, they would hang as traitors. And yet, a growing chorus of voices declared that the time had come. The war had changed minds. Britain's response to rebellion had been harsh burn towns, blockades, and threats of destruction. King George III declared the colonies to be in a state of open revolt, promising to crush them with force. To many Americans, this left no room for reconciliation. It was in this tense atmosphere that the Second Continental Congress reconvened. In Philadelphia, inside the Pennsylvania State House, what we now call Independence Hall, the heat of a Philadelphia summer hung heavy in the air as delegates debated their future. John Adams of Massachusetts argued passionately for independence. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, urged caution, hoping for one last chance at peace. But the tide had turned. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The motion was debated fiercely for weeks. In the end, it was clear the colonies would have to stand together, or not at all. To give form to their decision, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. 5 men were chosen: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a young delegate from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was only 33 years old, tall and soft-spoken, with a quiet intensity. The task of writing fell largely to him. Alone in a rented room, by candlelight, he put pen to paper. His words were not just a legal argument. They were a vision of a new world. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." In those lines, Jefferson captured an idea larger than the colonies themselves. It was a statement that governments existed only by the consent of the governed, and that when a government became destructive, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. These were dangerous words, revolutionary words, but they rang with a truth that resonated deeply. Jefferson listed the grievances against King George III: taxes imposed without consent, armies quartered in American homes, trade restricted, assemblies dissolved. Each complaint was a wound, and together, they painted a picture of tyranny. The draft was presented to Congress on June 28. For days, delegates debated, editing Jefferson's words, cutting sections, softening some phrases, sharpening others. Still, the heart of the document remained. Finally, on July 2, 1776, Congress voted. 12 colonies approved Lee's resolution for independence. Only New York abstained. That day, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, predicting that July 2nd would be celebrated for generations to come as America's great festival of freedom. He was almost right. 2 days later, on July 4th, the final text of the Declaration of Independence was approved. The bell in the State House rang out. Copies were printed and carried across the colonies, read aloud in town squares, pinned to church doors, announced with cheers and tears. For the first time, the people heard the words that declared them free. "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." It was not simply a statement, it was a promise, sealed with courage. Every man who signed the document knew he was placing his life at risk. John Hancock, President of Congress, signed first, his name large and bold. He wanted the king, he said, to read it without glasses. 50-6 men would add their names in the weeks that followed. Wealthy planters, humble lawyers, merchants, and farmers all bound together by an idea. The reaction was swift. In New York City, a statue of King George III was torn down by crowds, melted into bullets to be fired in the war. In villages and towns across America, fireworks and bonfires lit the night sky. For the first time, people began to call themselves not British, but Americans, but independence was not safety. Britain had the world's strongest navy, a professional army, and allies across Europe. The colonies had militia, courage, and hope. Ahead lay years of hardship, defeats and victories, suffering and sacrifice. The Declaration did not end the struggle. It began it, and yet, its power lay not only in war, but in words. The principles Jefferson wrote became more than a manifesto for 13 colonies. They became a promise that echoed through time, inspiring revolutions, movements, and nations across the globe. On that hot summer day in 1776, as the ink dried and the bells rang, no one could have known the full weight of what they had created. But they understood one thing clearly. They had declared to the world that freedom was worth everything. The American Revolution would continue for years, but its true birth was not in the clash of muskets or the smoke of battle. It was in the courage of words, in the belief that a people could govern themselves, and it began with a declaration simple, powerful, and everlasting.